Research Fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute. And today on our podcast, we'll be focusing on the issue of transportation policy. I'm very excited to speak to you, David, and just kind of explore a lot of many of the historical and current implications and issues we have been seeing with transportation equality and the impacts of transportation inequality on many marginalized communities. I'll give you the second to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. My name is David Wheaton. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an economic justice policy fellow with the Legal Defense Fund. I focus mainly on state and local advocacy efforts that address economic issues that are important to Black Americans. And I've been with LDF for almost 2 years now, and I'm really excited to be here.
Amazing. So, kind of jumping into our conversation of transportation inequality and a lot of your work, we want to start with some brief history. So, as your work as an LDF Economic Justice Policy Fellow, including work on issues of transportation inequality and inequity, what policies and historical developments do you see as shaping our current public transportation landscape?
Yeah, so there's been a lot, but one of the huge things I want to touch on are two, and that's one is intentional discrimination, and the second is redlining. So throughout the middle of the last century, starting in the 1940s, highways, especially car-centric infrastructure, really destroyed and devastated many Black neighborhoods throughout the country. For example, in New Orleans, in their Treme neighborhood, one of the oldest Black communities in the country, there was a thriving ecosystem on Claiborne Avenue. And unfortunately, that was destroyed by the building of Interstate I-10, which now towers over Claiborne Avenue and the Treme neighborhood. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that's had some disastrous environmental effects for the communities within New Orleans. But also, just talking about intentional discrimination in Montgomery and Alabama, I-85 cut through the city's only middle-class Black neighborhood in around the 1940s and 50s. And that was actually designed to displace and punish organizers of the civil rights movement, to intentionally punish them by ramming a highway right through their neighborhoods. And we also know in other communities, this has really devastated Black communities and also economic progress within those Black communities. And so we've seen a really intentional discrimination from federal actors, state actors, and local actors of really trying to cut away at Black neighborhoods and using transportation infrastructure projects to really cut through those Black neighborhoods. And then also just historical redlining trends. So beginning in the 1930s, when the federal government started to use redlining policies, you saw which neighborhoods were in the kind of worst areas, and a lot of those redline neighborhoods were Black and brown communities. And so that is where they started to put highways and other infrastructure projects in those red line communities, in those Black communities. So not only did you have the intentional discrimination of when the federal organizers and other people would try to put highways right through Black communities, you also had this the historical redlining part of that as well, as that those same infrastructure projects were put in those red line communities because those communities were deemed as the worst communities. And unfortunately, a lot of those communities were Black and brown communities.
Thank you so much for that response, David, especially kind of thinking about the intersection of federal, local, and state policies. Looking at the issues of transportation inequality is so important. And kind of segueing within what you mentioned about this kind of systemic patterns, how have systemic disinvestment and car-centric transportation policy at the local, state, and national levels, as you mentioned, impacted Black, low-income, and other marginalized communities specifically? I know you mentioned many cases in cities, but I would love just to hear any other examples and other ways you've seen this kind of manifest over the years and currently.
Yeah, definitely. So not only did this happen in the South, so I named some examples like Montgomery, Alabama, in New Orleans, and also, Houston, Texas, when highways I-10 and I-45 cut through the historic Fifth Ward neighborhood in Houston, Texas, but I also want to uplift this. It just didn't happen in the South, but in like places like Syracuse, New York. So, as part of the country's, interstate highway service, city officials there wanted to extend Highway I-81. And unfortunately, that would cut through right through their 15th ward, where nearly 90% of Syracuse's Black population lived. And so They were protesting locals, but unfortunately, they were ignored. And so that led to the loss of homes, churches, Black businesses, and resulted in actually displacement of more than 1,300 families, including majority Black families. And right now, if you look at the 15th Ward now in Syracuse, you could still see that the community still suffers in every way possible. So there's a lack of jobs right now. There's a lack of housing. There's a lack of schools, and the public health plunged. Unfortunately, while other things like crime, pollution, and poverty really spiked in the 15th Ward, you can really trace back the building of that highway and the siphoning off of resources by using that transportation infrastructure project that really siphoned off Syracuse's in the 15th Ward's resources. And so, unfortunately, that led to where the community is right now, where they are still trying to recover from, the disastrous policies of putting a highway right through their community. So that's just another example of how, and this was something that was brought up out of the local stage and approved. The state of New York approved this, and also the federal government gave this Syracuse and the state of New York funds for this project. So you can see how all three actors worked in a way that really deprived the Black community, and again lost, over 1,300 people lost their homes in this, and again including tons of Black businesses and churches and schools that were all destroyed by this infrastructure project in Syracuse, New York.
Thank you so much for that. I think we're seeing a lot of the intersection between transportation inequality and many other important issues like health, employment, kind of just the overall decline in communities and divestment. And thinking about the kind of impact on these communities that's not very much talked about. In doing our research for this episode, we found that Black workers are 4 times as likely to use public transit than white workers, but receive approximately only 24% worse transit inequality. Similarly, transit service is 37 less comprehensive in urban high poverty areas when compared to their wealthier communities. How do these research holdings reflect the realities you see when interacting with communities through your work?
Yeah, so it's really, really unfortunate that we see these numbers. And I think, part of it is something, in the housing world we call NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, right? And where you have, unfortunately, people who don't want transportation projects or any type of infrastructure that would benefit, Black and brown folks coming to their area. And so we often talk about infrastructure projects that, have hurt Black communities. But I think we don't talk enough about the infrastructure projects that have been proposed that could have helped Black communities, but have been starved of financial resources because there have been other actors who have not wanted to expand transportation resources for majority Black communities. And we've seen that in areas in the South and also areas throughout the country. And so it's really, really unfortunate because there is a imbalance where we have more Black and brown and low income folks that are trying to use transportation, but unfortunately, there just aren't the services there to really help them. And so, one example of that currently is Texas. So, right now, the state of Texas is actually illegal right now. There's a law on the books that says that state funding cannot be used for infrastructure for mass transportation infrastructure projects. It can only be used to build roads. And so, any type of local jurisdiction that wants to try to have mass transportation, they can't get state funds. They have to get just federal funds and then local funds. And so that's just one example of how we see states and other actors trying to use mass transportation that can really benefit and help Black and brown and working class families be able to better navigate and have better access to jobs and other opportunities, really be siphoned off because you have other folks that don't want those people entering into their communities and only want to focus on car-centric policy, which we know, again, just has a detrimental impact on Black and brown communities because a lot of our car-centric policies still today really, really still hurt Black and brown communities.
In regard to the long-standing neglect and discriminatory discriminatory practices and transportation planning. I know you mentioned Texas, and also you've done a lot of notable work in Baltimore. Could you talk us through the intersection of public transportation access and job access for Black and low income communities, and also thinking about the reversal of plans for the Baltimore Red Line and its purpose and intentional actions in failing to provide inequi- sorry, inequitable public transportation and equitable public transportation?
Yeah. So unfortunately, you really can't talk about Baltimore and the red line without first taking a step back and really understanding the historical disinvestment that state and federal actors have played in Baltimore's infrastructure woes right now. And so Baltimore was very historically discriminated against and disinvested in by state actors for a very, very long time. And so this meant that there were not as many economic opportunities for residents in Baltimore as there were for other residents throughout the state of Maryland. So once you kind of ground yourself in that fact, it was really remarkable when the state of Maryland said that they were going to invest and have a transportation project like the Red Line for Baltimore. And so, Baltimore really needed a light rail system that could connect thousands of low and middle income Black Baltimore residents. It connect them to better employment, healthcare, and educational opportunities. The Red Line would have expanded economic opportunity in a city that has struggled for decades with poverty and unemployment. But unfortunately, like you talked about, the project was brought to a halt in 2015 by then Governor Hogan when he announced that the construction of the Red Line would be permanently canceled. And what that meant is that the economic opportunity that could have been afforded to thousands and thousands of Black Baltimore residents would cease to exist. Right, for Baltimore right now is a major city that only has really a bus line. They have small rapid transit that runs from the airport into the city, and so there's really and that is just kind of for tourists. It's not for residents. It's not an economic corridor. What the Red Line would have represented was a corridor that really would have helped residents, again, get to better employment opportunities, healthcare opportunities, and educational opportunities. And so, unfortunately, when the governor halted the construction of the Red Line, he said it was in the best financial decision of the state. But then, even though the federal government and the state government have invested already $300 million into the project, but instead the governor relocated that money into a series of other transportation projects that are outside of Baltimore and really helped other areas within Maryland that already had transportation infrastructure already in place. And Baltimore is just a critical city that again is home to just a significant high population of Black residents that don't have access to those critical infrastructure projects. And so it was really, really sad to see. And then also there was a loss in jobs that could have came from that. There were businesses who wanted to build close to the Red Line. Those businesses no longer were able to continue with those plans. And so it not only had an effect on the residents' economic opportunities, but also just the city of Baltimore and trying to get a tax base where they can sustain themselves and give financial resources to their residents. And so, unfortunately, there's just already a lack of rapid transportation that exists for Black residents along the city's east to west corridor, unfortunately, in Baltimore.
Thank you for sharing that. I definitely see how kind of the continual effects of transportation inequality, it stems into so many other issues. I've seen in Baltimore, Houston's, New Orleans. And thinking of these three important case studies in examining transportation inequality, a big aspect of that is also kind of the environmental health of many of the Black communities. Can you talk a little bit about these examples and the impact of inequitable transportation policy on the environmental health of Black communities?
Yeah. So I mentioned New Orleans and how I-10 broke through and displaced their community in the Treme old historic neighborhood. And after doing research there were researchers in New Orleans that found that communities that lived right by I-10 suffered greatly from air pollution and had a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with asthma. And also, I mentioned Houston as well. And so Houston is actually expanding its highway, unfortunately. And again, it's tearing down more Black businesses, more Black churches, and also tearing down two public housing projects that were used primarily by Black and brown people. But also is going to cause already worsening asthma rates for Black and brown people who live close to I-10 in the historic Fifth Ward neighborhood. So anticipated an increase in traffic volume will also introduce just more air pollutants into their nearby communities. And this is unfortunately for children, due to their developing brain, lungs, heart, and circulatory systems, children are especially vulnerable to the negative effects of air pollution. And so we've really seen this have an effect on our Black children as well, and asthma rates. And again, like I said, the asthma rates at schools along I-45 already have higher asthma rates than other schools in the Houston Independent School District. And so this is really, really sad to see, but is affecting majority Black and brown populations when we build these highways and these car-centric projects so close to Black and brown communities. And again, that's a historic designation, but also because of historic governmental policies like redlining and other intentional discrimination mechanisms, where we have people still today that are having negative health effects and environmental justice effects because of the highways that we continue to build and the highways that have already been built on the backs of Black and brown communities.
Thank you so much for that. And kind of thinking of the present day and thinking of the questions of what can we do? How can we start looking at policy and legislation to truly be a commissioner for change? Hearing of your intersections of like housing inequality, economic inequality, and just tying it back to public transportation equality, that brings into the question of transit-oriented development. And to you, if you could answer this, what is transit-oriented development, and how can it foster both transportation equity and housing access? Can you speak about an example of a city you think of that does transit-oriented development well?
Yeah, so transit-oriented development is development, housing development, and other economic opportunity development that is built close to transit-oriented projects. So if you have a station, a railway station, or if you're using a local subway station, to have housing built near that subway station, so somebody does not have to take a car to then get to that transportation needs. They can either walk or use some other type of transportation to get to that kind of mass transportation, and then that takes them to their economic destination. And so you want to make sure you're building your jobs around transit-oriented developments as well, so that when people get off those trains and that mass transportation, they're able to have easy access to their jobs and other economic and educational opportunities as well. So that's transit-oriented development. Some places that have done transit-oriented development well, I would say, is the District of Columbia, or DC. And that is just because of their dedication to building transit-oriented development. So in their grants and their process making, they actually encourage developers and developments to come close to their transit-oriented development. And also when they're thinking about building new stations and other new mass transportation opportunities, they're also thinking about how can we include transit-oriented developments around these systems already. So whether it's, making sure we're building a station that can also be built next to apartment complexes, supermarkets, other places that can provide some type of economic opportunity for people who will be riding mass transportation. And as we know before, we know that a lot of Black and brown low income people do use and utilize mass transportation. The one caveat I would say that I think DC and other people who are thinking about transit-oriented development need to heed to is just making sure that the transit-oriented development stays affordable for people in those areas. So right now, even though DC does a good job, unfortunately, with gentrification and rising costs of rents, we've really seen people not be able to afford to live close to those transit-oriented developments. And so they're having to live further and further out. That means they're commuting again, maybe by car to go to that mass transportation center that then takes them maybe into downtown or into another area of economic opportunity. And so really making sure that we're using like programs like the low income housing tax credit program that helps affordable housing developers build affordable housing, making sure we're giving those projects that are near transit oriented developments, maybe higher scores or some preferential treatment to make sure they're getting the credit. So to make sure that those developments are affordable so that people can actually live in those areas, and also bringing and making sure that you're building transit oriented development in high opportunity areas as well. So that make sure that again people who use and utilize transit oriented development are able to then use that mass transportation to get to high economic opportunity areas so that they can better themselves both educationally and by other economic opportunities that they may see fit to have.
And I know another big aspect of moving toward transportation equity is also thinking of policy. So, kind of segueing into this question, now that we've kind of addressed the problems and consequences, what are some effective policy interventions that can promote equity in transportation planning and ensure the needs of vulnerable populations are met?
Yeah, so there's really two things. One, I want to is the new Reconnecting Communities program from the Department of Transportation. So this program was thought about to really help communities that I highlighted in the beginning, communities like New Orleans and Montgomery and Houston and Syracuse, who have been devastated by these highway projects, to actually figure out and give grants to these local jurisdictions and say, how can we actually reconnect these communities? How can we bring about that we can reconnect the Treme neighborhood in New Orleans or the Fifth Ward neighborhood in Houston or the 15th Ward neighborhood in Syracuse, New York? How can we utilize transit-oriented development or other infrastructure projects to help reconnect these communities? So I think that is a key to help solve the problem that happened in the 1940s and 50s, and something that we can do now to try to help solve those problems. And then the second thing I would say is making sure that our state, local, and federal leaders are listening to the needs of local people on the ground. One of the reasons that we saw so many programs and projects that destroy Black communities is because those state officials and local officials either weren't listening to those Black communities or ignored those Black communities. And so we need to make sure that our state and local communities, as well as our federal and the Department of Transportation or other federal agencies, are listening to communities and saying, no, we don't want this, or yes, we do want this transit-oriented development project. One example is happening right now in South Carolina and in the Gullah Geechee area of Hilton Head Island. Where the town has proposed trying to widen Highway 278. But local people on the ground, including a majority Black area in the Gullah Geechee community, saying, no, we don't want this expanded. This is going to hurt our community. This is going to, again, take away land from Black and brown communities to expand the highway in a car-centric project that is not going to economically benefit any of the Gullah community. And so making sure that not only are they, voicing their opinions, but our local, state, and federal partners are listening to those communities when they say, no, this is not going to be a good project for us. Please listen to us. So that's another thing that state, local, and federal partners can do, along with the Reconnecting Communities program, to really try to help reverse some of the harm that's already been done going forward.
Thank you so much for that. There truly is so much power when the officials really listen and recognize the needs of their community. And I think a key theme in what you said is the power of the individual. So, segueing into this question, what are steps that individuals can take to become involved in advocating for equitable public transportation? How can organizations and advocates foster this collective action?
Yeah, so it's going to kind of tie back into the earlier point where when I talked about making sure that you are trying to stay organized, and then also that you utilize any type of public comment period And also just try to get your neighbors involved. I think one thing that I have really seen is that when communities really get together and start to make noise about projects and infrastructure projects that they do want or don't want, officials really start to take note. So just understanding, know that you have power within yourself, and you also have power when you organize with other people within your community. And there's resources and tools out there from organizations like LDF and PolicyLink and other transit equity focused organizations that can help, with helping you and other community members get organized. But I would really say is try to organize within your community. Go try to talk to your planning boards. Try to be involved as much as you can, because your input and your involvement really does make the difference. Public officials don't always listen, but increasingly, especially when there's an organized effort, you see public officials really listen to communities when they talk about projects they don't want or they do want, and also talk about what are the benefits of this project, and what are the not benefits, what are things that may not be benefits for a certain project as well. And so, but those are the things I would say is just to utilize organizing your community, and then also just organizing yourself as well, and just knowing that even one person that comes out and speaks against something could also ultimately be a change. And then one other kind of other tool that we've seen is a tool called Title VI, which is part of the Civil Rights Act. And people have been utilizing a Title VI complaint, which says that a certain project is going to have a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people. And so when people were trying to stop the highway in Houston from going into effect, those communities use a Title VI complaint to really sound the alarm to the Department of Transportation to say, hey, this is really affecting, majority Black communities, right? They're going to be tearing down Black people's homes and Black elementary schools that were attended by majority Black students and Black churches, and public housing projects that were lived in by majority Black people, right? And this is going to have an outsized effect on the Black Houston area. And so also utilizing, Title VI complaints as well can also be an effective tool for stopping infrastructure projects that could have disproportionate harm to Black and brown communities.
Thank you so much, David. Truly thankful for all the insights you've given us and just a lot of hope for what's to come for transportation equity.